It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. This is Walter Cronkite in our newsroom in New York City. There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have just learned, however, that Father Huber, one of the 2 priests called into the room, has administered the last sacrament of the church to President Kennedy. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The bulletin is that our correspondent in Dallas, Dan Rather, reports that the Dallas police have arrested a 30-year-old man who was found with a weapon in his possession.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back in to another podcast by George. Still under kind of a self-quarantine here, waiting for COVID to pass, and it's getting worse all the time. We got that news yesterday, folks, about the Pfizer Corporation and this vaccine that they're developing. And honest to God, this is the way my mind thinks. I knew that I had Gerald Posner coming up on the podcast. It's that time of year when I want to talk about the Kennedy assassination because that's a huge part of my life. But Gerald wrote a book that released this past spring, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. And one of the things I remember about it, and a lot of people might think it's about the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma, which it is, but it's even bigger than that. He spent 5 years writing this thing, and it's all about the intertwined history of the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. And Pfizer played a big role of that in that with the Sacklers, and that's what I was thinking of, and I think maybe that's where we're going to start. Gerald Posner, welcome back to a podcast by George.
George, great to be with you. You know, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you the last 5 years on the pharmaceutical industry, I published the book Simon & Schuster did on March 10th, and March 11th, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic, so a 16-city book tour was canceled. You know, we went virtual, and we've also been trying to get the word out. But what's interesting is what you just said a second ago about Pfizer. 2 German-American cousins after the Civil War saw this amazing demand for morphine. And with a $2,500 loan and $1,000 saved up, they started a chemical plant in Brooklyn and became Pfizer and Company. They would have been very proud of what Pfizer announced the other day, which is looks like the first of the vaccines, and there will be a few of them as I talk about. This is about billions of dollars in revenue, as well as saving lives. It's both for the drug industry because it meets at that intersection of public health and profit. They will get that vaccine out. If they're close to 90%, that will be astonishing because the FDA has set the bar at 50%. Efficacy. So 90% would be a home run, and we'll have competitors from Johnson & Johnson and others coming in, I'm sure, not long after that.
Well, that 90% thing is also what I wanted to talk about because I saw the some of the news coverage, and they had research spokespeople on for Pfizer, and they were almost doing a happy dance talking about that 90% level and saying that it's close to being what the measles vaccine is like. And, you know, if people get vaccinated for the measles, they don't worry about it. They can go on about their normal lives. And I thought, well, that's really great. But that guy, I'm watching this coverage, and that's almost like marketing what this guy was doing. And I'm flashing back to your book and Pfizer's role in the marketing of these pharmaceuticals. And of course, for the vaccine to be effective, we got to trust these people. We got to believe in it. We've got to take the vaccine. How does that strike you after the research that you've done?
I'm not going to be first in line. I mean, I'm going to wait to make sure that the vaccine is safe and effective. And if COVID continued to disrupt our life, then I'll consider getting in line and taking that vaccine. But one thing I know from the history of the drug industry is don't believe the press releases. And that's exactly right, George. Your antenna was up and you were right. What we're getting now from the drug companies are the rah-rah These are the press releases. Here's where we're good. They've all made money off of that. Their stock prices have gone up every time they have half of a good result. And one of the things I want to see is we're talking about a sample that's not that big. We're going to be distributing the vaccine to hundreds of millions of people potentially around the world. So does that 90% hold up? And what does it mean? It's not like the measles in this sense, because one thing we know from all of these vaccines, this isn't like polio where you get a shot and you might have some immunity for the rest of your life. In this case, they expect you to get some antibodies to the virus, because we don't have any at all because it's a new virus, and maybe some T cell response, which deepens your immune response. That's going to be temporary. 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, you're going to need a booster shot. And that's where the real money is for Pfizer and other companies. They're going to be able to roll this out, get a lot of people to take it. The next year, they're going to be able to give it again. Government's going to have to stockpile it. And I think it's a revenue stream of billions of dollars for many of the big pharma companies going forward.
I got just listening to you talk, I'm struck by the fact, Gerald Posner, folks, he's one of the world's leading investigative journalists, obviously. Listen to him talk about this stuff with the pharmaceutical industry. He's like a medical expert. He became like a ballistics expert investigating the Kennedy assassination. My God, all the things that you have learned and shared with the rest of us in the course of your lifetime and all of these books that you've written. I mean, does that part of it ever strike you?
You know, it's interesting. I'm very lucky because I work with my wife, Tricia, who's also an author. She had a book out a couple of years ago. Her last one was called The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, about the Bayer pharmacist who ends up running the dispensary at the biggest concentration camp, first time story. And she's a great researcher. We pick these projects together. We do all the interviews together. And then I write the first draft of my name's going on the front cover. She writes the first draft of her name's going on. And then we edit it and we continue to work on it. And we're lucky to share the passion as we did on pharma. And before that, you're right, on Kennedy and on the Vatican and on finances and many different subjects. But I'm also lucky, George, and this is critical, and you know this because you do a lot of interviews. You do a lot of interviews with writers and authors. I'm lucky to have a publisher who allows me to pick a subject on which I haven't drawn my conclusions, because I think the biggest problem in journalism is that a lot of writers get out there, they already know what they think the answer is, and then they go ahead and they do the research just to fill in and back up their early suspicion of what they thought was right. They don't really go out and let the evidence take them wherever it does. I don't know what the answers are when I get into these subjects, so I'm willing to follow them, and that's absolutely critical. And the publisher is willing to give me the latitude to come back and say, I don't know what I'm going to write, but eventually I'll find out the right answer for you.
Well, I love the fact that you can tell this big story, like this American history, basically. God, this could be PBS type stuff with violins playing when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry. That's what I think about. And then the little minutia, the little details that make pharma such a great book. And one example that I recall is and again, I think it involves Pfizer, certainly the Sacklers, but anybody that's ever gone to a doctor's office and you've sat in the waiting room and watched this parade of usually very well-dressed young women coming in with, sometimes I see trays of donuts for the staff and all that kind of stuff. That's marketing, folks. And it started with the Sacklers and Pfizer. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, it's so interesting because, you know, something you said, George, in every subject I go on to, in every new book, I have to learn it from the ground up. I sort of recreate the wheel because it's new to me. But in this book on pharma, the first year, I'm not a science guy. I was a political science major. So I had to learn the science. I had to know enough about the drug industry, the drugs themselves, the diseases, that when I went out and had interviews with infectious disease experts, they wouldn't start laughing at me and say, who the hell is he trying to do this book? So that first year was a deep dive on science. And what comes out of it is very interesting because you're right. The sales and the marketing of it. It's Arthur Sackler, who's a psychiatrist. So are his two brothers, the name sounds familiar to your listeners. That's the family that owns Purdue Pharma, whose blockbuster OxyContin is sort of the poster child as the narcotic opioid painkiller that's addicted a lot of people and led to a lot of deaths in this opioid crisis and epidemic. But the Sacklers go back to the 50s. And it was Arthur, the oldest of the three brothers, who came up with the idea for marketing in an aggressive way. 4-color ads, take out the big splashy pages, come up with, as you call them, the sales reps, the men and women who go to the doctors and form these friendships and try to get them, encourage them to write more prescriptions. He was the one who came came up with the idea for what I call pharmaceutical swag, gifts to doctors, speakers bureaus where doctors could get paid to go and talk about the drug they're prescribing. So if it's February in the middle of New York or in Boston, you might be able to go to the Bahamas and give a talk. That was a great thing. And Sackler went to the head of Pfizer in the late 50s. Pfizer had an antibiotic called terramycin. It was one molecule of difference from a competitor's antibiotic. It was no different at all in the way it was dosed or in its effectiveness. But Sackler said, I can make that the number one antibiotic in America if you give me a $7 to $10 million ad budget. And they thought he was crazy, but they gave it to him, and he did. He made it the biggest selling drug in America, and then he went on for Hoffmann La Roche to make Librium and then Valium. Valium, the biggest selling drug in the world. For 15 years, it became the first $100 million seller in the industry and the first billion-dollar seller, all as a result of the hard sell advertising that we are now accustomed to with the drug industry.
Wow, and to get us to where we're at now, and I follow this a little bit, but I know one of those Sacklers died, I think, and I know that company has filed for bankruptcy and they've been fined, and there's some criminal trial stuff going on. I guess bring us up to date on that, and then, you know, I always look at this and think, wow, they're really rich. These people made billions of dollars off of this damn OxyContin. Those kind of people don't go to jail usually, and they usually end up all right financially. Is that going to happen with what's left of the Sackler family?
Unfortunately, you know, you didn't even need to do the research, George, and you already know what the result's going to be. Yeah, they're not going to lose their country club memberships. And this was not, by the way, you know, this is very interesting because Purdue is a privately owned company. The Sackler family owned it. They bought it in 1952. So it's not like a public company, Johnson & Johnson or TiVo, these companies with a lot of shareholders. The family has it, and they are a one-hit wonder. We've all heard of, you know, one-hit wonders for bands. They had one song, that was it. Yeah. The one hit here is OxyContin. They didn't have any other drug. And OxyContin, from the time it went on sale in 96 through 2018, the last year of full sales we had, took in $35 billion in revenue. The Sacklers were wealthy beforehand, but they, in 2015, entered the Forbes richest families list at an estimated net worth of $14 billion, all of it from OxyContin. And now the company, Purdue, has filed bankruptcy, as you said, last year in federal court, and the Sacklers went before the judge and said, by the way, Your Honor, we aren't bankrupt. We have a lot of money, but we'd like to have all these thousands of lawsuits that name us as having led this overzealous marketing campaign and sold OxyContin possibly when we knew it was addictive and downplaying the risk. We'd like them stayed because maybe we'll be able to work out a global settlement. And what they are offering is about $3 billion toward a settlement that will eventually pay out to thousands of different plaintiffs across the country. They will walk away with billions of dollars still in their profits, and nobody will go to jail for this. The government keeps saying we reserve the right to bring criminal charges, but, you know, George, nobody's investigating them for that. So unfortunately, I am speaking out against it, but I think it's a travesty of justice that the family that helped create this crisis will probably leave as not as big billionaires as they were when it started, but still with more money than you can imagine.
Well, before we transition over to a brief discussion about the JFK assassination, folks, everybody wants to talk to Gerald this time of year. I mean, he's got this book going, and we're coming up on November 22nd, so his time is very limited. One thing I wanted to get in here is I'm a big supporter of Chelsea Manning, Eric Snowden, Julian Assange, and those types of people, the whistleblowers and the journalists and the publishers and all that type of thing. The whistleblowers in particular played a role in your book, Pharma.
Yeah, you know, as a matter of fact, it was very interesting because at one point I ended up getting a manila envelope that arrived at my office with a postmark from New York, no return address, and inside were documents that purported to be DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration documents from 2002, 2001. So what I had to do was then spend about a month verifying that they were real. I wanted to make sure somebody wasn't sending me fake documents just to make sure that I reported the wrong thing. And then once I found out they were real, they laid out an incredible, really mouth, sort of staggered, your jaw drops fight in the early 2000s between the DEA, George, and the FDA. The DEA saying, by the way, we see diversion and abuse of OxyContin. This is a very early stage. The drug's only been out there for 5 years, and we'd like to take additional steps to limit its distribution and how it's written by doctors. And the FDA say, no, it's fine, don't worry, no problem at all. And they push back and they allowed that drug continue to be sold as it was. This was a crisis that could have been stopped. We now know as a result of that whistleblower nearly 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it wasn't. I don't think it was because of bribery. It wasn't because of bad faith in the FDA. The FDA, as you know from this book, is overwhelmed. They don't have enough people to stay abreast of everything the drug industry does. They don't have enough regulators. They keep getting papered to death by pharma. And so in the end, they're inefficient often. And in this case, they were just asleep at the wheel. And that's really a shame because it resulted in a lot of endless lives in addiction.
Wow, just a wonderful book. I'm going to put the cover of that book up and the covers of some of your other books. And folks, we're talking to Gerald Posner. Now, the way I first became aware of him is because of this book that's just off of my left side, and Case Closed. And there's a theme that runs through America, runs through your books, and it's this media involvement thing. And I think everything that we are, everything that happens in this country is media related. And going back to the JFK assassination, I've been relooking your book, and as we come up on the November 22nd, I don't even know how to phrase this exactly. Maybe you can help me out with it. But I was in 3rd grade. You were in 4th grade. I remember as a kid that was growing up and watching television and seeing the serial combat and watching Wagon Train and Rawhide and all those types of things that people were really into back then. My first reaction as a child to JFK being shot, and I think a lot of people, was he couldn't be killed. He was one of the good guys. Good guys got flesh wounds. They didn't get their heads blown off by a guy with a $13 rifle in Dealey Plaza. I think that conditioning that we all have in this country because of television, Hollywood, now the internet and that type of thing, I think that really colored our perception and still does of what's happening in our world, and with that assassination.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's very interesting. I believe that if and who knows if this is right or not, the Zapruder film was the rights to the Zapruder film being the home movie of the assassination. For the few listeners who are listening to you who may not know it, the home movie by a Dallas dressmaker, Abraham Zapruder, Life magazine, Time Life, bought the rights to it. And they ran clips inside, or pictures, still pictures inside their magazine in Life. And then they sort of hid that film, because they had the rights to it, from public view until the mid-1970s when Geraldo Rivera finally had it out on TV for the first time. I think if that film had been out earlier, and maybe people had been able to analyze it and see it, and it wasn't viewed as though a big secret. So instead, George, we're left with the idea, we're kids at the time, but our parents and others are left with the idea that the president's been killed by a long-distance shot. It's a rifle. We aren't accustomed to that in assassinations. We're used to somebody running up with a pistol, shooting you at the side, and then they get tackled. So the long-distance rifle raises all the specter of Day of the Jackal, a hired assassin. Then the guy who's caught as the assassin doesn't look like he's out of central casting in Hollywood.
Oh.
He's 24 years old, just turned 24. So this sociopathic loser in life who had defected to the Soviet Union and now was back here with a mediocre rifle and a gun that nobody would choose, they think, for their assassination rifle. Then he's killed 2 days later by a fellow who looks like he is out of central casting as a wannabe mobster, owns a nightclub in Dallas, and you're off and running. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Then you don't have the Zapruder film out for over 10 years. You hide the information about the autopsy, which is okay, but once you hide information, people think you're hiding the evidence of a crime, and no wonder nobody really started to believe it. So I think that if the internet had existed back at the time that Kennedy was killed, the conspiracy theories would have started 10 minutes after the assassination. The only difference would be we'd have 20 cell phone videos of the murder, and maybe we wouldn't be stuck just on looking at the Zapruder film. There'd be 30 Zapruder films.
Yeah, good point. You know, and again, I sometimes we can't. I don't know if it's Hollywood or if it's reality. Sometimes I'm struck by, and I think he's maybe a friend of yours. I know you know him. That the Dallas newspaper man that got a lot of notoriety. I think he's becoming very old now, but he was throughout all the literature and has been interviewed a number of times. He actually
Hugh Ainsworth.
Yes, yeah, Hugh. He said, you know, what people don't realize or understand is the police that I was involved with back then, and they were real close to the Keystone Cops. This was in Dallas, and this is a part of it. People, because of Hollywood, they don't believe that the police and the FBI can be as inept as they appear to have been back then. And a couple of examples, and so they think conspiracy. It just can't be that way. But I mean, I really think they kind of were Keystone Cops. How in the hell could James Hosty, the FBI agent there in Dallas, who knew Lee Harvey Oswald and had been in touch with him, had been to his house and that type of thing, with the president coming to Dallas, knowing the motorcade route, surely he knew that after it was announced, allow Lee Harvey Oswald to stay in a building that had 6 floors with open windows? I mean, was he that dumb or was he in on it? I kind of look at these types of things and think, you know what? I think he was that dumb.
Yeah, you know, George, that's why I share the same belief with you. Look, I was a political science major at Berkeley in the early 70s. I'm probably one of the few Berkeley grads who thinks Oswald alone killed Kennedy. But I learned one thing from political science, and that was I definitely have a view of government as more inefficient and bungling at times than being the James Bonds of the world. People think, and it's very, very interesting, because if you actually go out and you have a discussion with somebody about government, they will complain and rail about the fact that the government, whether it's local, state, or federal, they didn't build a local homeless shelter on time or in budget. They're ruining things at the VA. They're not delivering the proper healthcare service. They just built a stadium that went and highways. They're twice the budget and 6 years late. But somehow we believe that the same people can't do any of that. When they do something nefarious, like decide to kill the president, they pull it off perfectly with every T crossed and every I dotted. And what I always come back to, and this is critical, the CIA and the mafia, they were involved in the early 60s trying to kill a head of state. There's no doubt about it. And it wasn't Kennedy, it was Fidel Castro. And guess what? There they were, the Keystone Cops. 7 times they couldn't even wound Castro. They had all the plots. They wanted to get Cuba back. The CIA wanted the communists out of Cuba, and the mafia wanted them to build and put their casinos back. So they had good incentive. They couldn't even get to wound him. But here we're to believe that in Dallas, they not only killed Kennedy, but they pulled off the perfect crime. Because as it's coming on 60 years later, we still can't find credible evidence of anybody other than Oswald. And I will tell you that I instead look at the CIA, and they're the same organization that didn't know the Shah of Iran was going to fall until he fell. The same group of intelligence people that had the helicopters flying at too low a level when Jimmy Carter sent in the rescue squads to try to get our people back from Iran, and they got sand inside of them and they had to come back. This is an agency that time and time again, well-intentioned, and they do a lot of good, but they also at times screw it up. But I've never seen them as being able to fulfill a James Bond sequel in any way.
Well, we're out of time, and I knew that would happen. A couple of quick hitters for you, things that pop into my mind that I want to know the answer to all the time. Why in the hell haven't we been able to determine at this point in time how Jack Ruby got down that ramp or got through that side door to get into the basement of the Dallas Police Department? Why didn't they put all those cops on lie detectors, or why weren't they able to figure that out?
Yeah, well, because they were embarrassed by it. I mean, there's no question about that. The one thing they wanted to do, Ruby should never have been at police headquarters for the entire weekend. And as you know, he was there on Friday night. He was there on Saturday. He wanders down on Sunday and goes into the garage. The police headquarters was not closed off. It wasn't cordoned off. And a guy like Jack Ruby handing out his business card saying, by the way, after this is all over, be sure to stop by and see my club, wasn't the person that you would really want there. So I think what the police did when that was finished, nobody really wanted to ask the questions too much about how did you miss Jack coming down the ramp just before Oswald was transferred. Even if they had, George, I don't think that anybody would have thought he's walking down that ramp. He's been here for the last 2 days. When Oswald was taken out and walked down the hallway, he's walking down the ramp in order to kill Oswald. They would have probably let Jack walk down the ramp and see Lee transferred. So it was that type of, you said, it's a small group in the Dallas Police Department. It was very chummy. They were all friendly with Ruby. They liked him. And so Ruby had access that he shouldn't have had looking back on it.
And why wasn't the potential of a Ruby conspiracy laid to rest via the guy that he lived with? Why weren't they able to get what they needed to know from this individual? I've always wondered about that. Was he kind of vacant-headed? Or, I mean, he surely could have laid it out for him, don't you think?
Yeah, I would think so. George Senator, and it's very interesting because, there were rumors at the time, and I mentioned this in the book, that Ruby, in fact, was gay. He had a male roommate, never as proven, but it was certainly something the Warren Commission decided not to discuss.
He said he was his boyfriend, right?
Yeah, that's right. They were very gentle with Senator. In addition, although I agree that the Warren Commission, as you know, came to the right conclusion about Oswald, I disagree with them about the sequence of the shots, and I disagree with them also on Ruby in the sense that I think they should have more aggressively pursued the questions of whether Ruby had mob connections. It turns out he did not, and some of the information that the Warren Commission didn't use was FBI wiretaps of the Chicago office of Sam Giancana, who was the godfather of Chicago, who carried on conversations in the aftermath of the assassination. They didn't know who Jack Ruby was. But the reason those were not in the Warren Commission is those were illegal wiretaps that the FBI had. And I talked to Bill Romer, the agent from Chicago, who had placed those taps in on Chicago and what they heard about them. And after the assassination was the best evidence, the virgin tape recordings of those mafiosa from Chicago and other places in their clubhouses where they thought no one else was listening to them, having no idea what had just happened in Dallas and no idea who Jack Ruby was.
One final question, and you can make this very quick. Max Holland is a big proponent of the fact that first shot, the timing of it was different than the Warren Commission. Like you, he believes there were 3 shots. You thought that the first one maybe hit the tree, and I've always wondered what the hell. Oswald wouldn't shoot into a tree, I don't think. He might have. But what do you think about it possibly hitting that arm of the stoplight that Holland proposes?
Absolutely. It hit something because we know that bullet deflected and went out, 500 feet from the depository and then hit a curbstone and wounded a bystander, Jim Teague. So whatever it hit, it didn't go on a straight line. If it had gone on a straight line, it would have hit the car, it would have hit somebody inside the car. Something moved the path of that bullet. And it's the sharpest angle of the shot. Remember, Oswald has to take that gun, aim it at the car moving underneath him as it's making that left turn. And that's not only the sharpest angle for the shot itself, there is the tree a little bit there, there's the light. And so whatever it was deflected it again, they never even put a cherry picker up, went up and examined that tree or the light in detail to see what it was, where that chip might have been. That's unfortunate. It would have been great to have resolved that at the time.
Well, the final thing I'll say, it's a testament, I've always said this, to the power of 2 nuts with cheap guns. I mean, it's amazing how the course of human history maybe can be changed by a couple of nuts with the really bad arms.
George, you're right. And Jack Ruby changed history because he robbed us of the chance to know what really happened in the assassination. I mean, if somebody had killed James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King, 2 days after Ray had been picked up by the police, we would still be thinking there was something more to that case. So Ruby did a great disservice to history. And Oswald does show, and I think people forget this, how one person armed with a gun can change the course of history in our lives forever. We will never know how many times in history somebody has gone to a political rally with a gun, hoping to get a chance to shoot at some leader that they want to take down, and they never got the opportunity. Oswald that day was not on a suicide mission. If some of his coworkers had stayed up on the 6th floor for lunch and they hadn't gone down, he wasn't going to take out the rifle and start shooting and have them tackle him. If there had been Secret Service, as you said, posted in the building across and able to see in, he might not have taken that shot. He would have gone home that night, put the rifle away, and maybe at 50 years of age would have been looking back to what he almost did 25 years earlier. But in this case, everything was the perfect storm. It broke just right for him. And unfortunately, by a matter of less than 2 inches on that final shot, he's able to kill Kennedy as opposed to just having a failed assassination. And here we are talking about him all these years later. The happiest person in the world would have been Lee Harvey Oswald himself, who thought of himself as somebody who had important things to say about history. And here he is. He's changed history, but not for the better.
Yeah. Well, there it is. We're out of time, folks. And Gerald, last word now. Either Pharma, folks, buy that book, or Case Closed. How do you want to close up shop with us today?
If you want to know, the second last chapter in Pharma is called The Coming Pandemic. So if you want to know about the drug industry and what you're going to be dealing with, you take a pill, buy the book Pharma. If you want a dose of common sense and want to find out what happened in a great murder mystery in JFK, look for Case Closed.
That's great. Folks, Gerald, thanks for coming on a podcast by George.
George, thank you so much, as always. Great to see you.
We'll revisit. I hope we can get back with you next year, maybe earlier if we can. Folks, that's Gerald Posner, and I hope you like this edition of Podcast by George. If you did, please subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and all those various places where podcasts are seen or heard. You can subscribe on podcastbygeorge.com. And go to Posner.com, and you can see or Posner.com, I get that name wrong, and check out all of his books, because, I mean, he's got a bunch of them, and they're all good, including one on the assassin of Martin Luther King, that James Earl Ray that we talked about. A great book on that. So that's going to do it for now. We're out of time. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.